And we hit the podium of the 50 most relevant. Number 3, Harry Sheezel. The top 3 of the players that I believe we must have a conversation about this preseason. He's incredibly relevant. Yes, it's a subjective list, but to me, of all the defensive eligible options, he is the most relevant. Joining me to unpack his fantasy footy previous potential outcomes and the previous opportunities he's had, and also looking forward at what we might just get in 2025. It's fellow coaches panelist Kane. Hello, mate. Nice to be chatting with you. It's the last time on the 50, but there is not many better players to talk about this preseason than Harry Sheezel.
MJ, if we wanted to, we could do this podcast in 1 minute, and that might be spending too long on Harry Sheezel. He is just that good. It's just incredible, this new wave of player that come in, and these draftees feel more prepared than ever. But clearly what Harry's done is a level that realistically we haven't seen better from a draftee, right? Like to come in and be nearly nudging 100 in your first season, to back it up in your second season with an average over 110. Like for a lot of players in the comp, MJ, this is a career year. And these are guys that have been in the comp 10, 15 years, and 110 was that. Remember that 110 season they had when they were absolutely shooting the lights out? In his second season, he's already done it. So where do you want to go? Because I feel like with Harry, he's ticked so many boxes already in his career, but there's still a lot of question marks, not so much on him, but on how this North Melbourne team comes together and where we see them going forward as obviously they try to charge towards finals and beyond.
Yeah, I think it's looking back a little bit at what he's done for us last year to just remind ourselves of how good he is in so many different functions. Defensive eligible only. I got to be surprised. I was shocked when I didn't see him as a defender mid, but we'll take it. I know some are thinking this is our pathway to the defensive forward status. Shut that thing down. That's not going to happen. This is where keeper and triple position players might be getting some luck, but no, he's not getting that landing his way. An average of 112 last year in fantasy. Outrageous. He is north of that $1.1 million price point and just knocking on the door of a seasonal average of 120 in SuperCoach. He is over $630,000. His career high scores last year were also seasonal high scores last year. 160 in SuperCoach, 159 in AFL fantasy. They came both against Geelong, but in different games against Geelong for what it's worth. He's just such a smart footballer, Kane. Like you talk about this level of professionalism. He has come into this AFL system beautifully. And while many contrasted him to a Steve Johnson, where it's if he gets the ball centre forward, look out, a score involvement is coming. He's so smart and so clever with how he uses the ball and sets up his teammates. And it's no surprise he's top 5 in the league for effective disposals, top 6 last year for uncontested possessions. That's not cheap football. That is work rate that is getting him into these positions. But now I don't think he's just a Steve Johnson clone. I think he's almost becoming Scott Pendlebury. So smart, so clean. It just does not make a wrong decision at all. And much like how Scott Pendlebury for the first 12 years of his football career was incredibly fantasy football relevant, almost from the moment he ventured into the AFL system, I think that's exactly what Harry Sheezel is presenting for us at this early part of his AFL career.
What's incredible, MJ, too, is that he's already at 44 career games. And the 2 that he missed was the last 2 of the season where he had an ankle injury. It sounded like he could have played if it was a final, but again, probably smart when you've got a guy in his second year absolutely on fire. You take the cautious approach. He missed those 2 games, but he's already got that under his belt. And you've seen the progression from the first 20 to the most recent 20, and it's just ridiculous. As I said, to go from a 97 to 110 plus, and the score build, which we always love talking about, is phenomenal already. Like he's nudging 30 touches a game, over 6 marks, and nearly 4 tackles. For a guy that I think we see as a slight, as you sort of mentioned before, almost like was a crafty forward is how he was portrayed in his draft year as a guy that, lives inside sort of the forward 50, half forward flank, create, kick goals. But he's already found a contested game to him as well. and he's still adding the scoreboard. So to be just under a goal a game in your second year, ticking all those boxes, I think that's what's so impressive is we've seen him at halfback in what we'd probably say is a way to ease young players into the league. Easier to find the ball. You can take some kick-ins. Not as much heat on the possession coming out of D50. But we already saw in the back half of last year, he moved into the midfield and started being a goal-kicking mid. And that's what I think is so phenomenal about him already is it seems like it doesn't matter on the role. He's just a classy user and already one of the best players at North Melbourne. And if not, the competition is particularly ball in hand, MJ. Like the stuff he can do, his composure, the way he creates, I think that's where those Scott Pendlebury comps come from is just he doesn't waste the ball at all.
Last year in AFL Fantasy, 16 tons, 9 of them over 120. Just the 2 scores all year, dropping below 80, and third overall average behind Marshall and Cherry. While in SuperCoach, 18 tons, 10 over 120. And again, just the 2 scores below 80 and top 7 across the formats for average overall. It was unbelievable year because we watched what he did in these first 7 games of the year where he was back in that halfback distribution role and he was scoring like an absolute maniac. We are talking 125 in AFL Fantasy, 124 in SuperCoach. Absolutely incredible territories. And if you didn't have Sheezel at that point in time of the year, your season was fast getting taken away from you. You can really justify getting away with one of these steam trains to start the year. If you miss on multiple steam trains, you're cooked. So if you missed Cherry, you missed Gorn, you missed Sheezel, you missed Heaney, if you miss more than one of those to start 2024, wow, the amount of work rate you've got to put into your other sort of 28 selections, it really does make it hard. It was incredible. And then there was this, whether it was the causation or correlation, I think only North Melbourne truly ever know. But the media heat came on North Melbourne, specifically around Harry, which was, you've got an unbelievable player here, just getting cheap, quote unquote, ball off the half back. Inject him into the midfield. Actually, let's see him in more damaging places. Let him see what he does forward of the ball, not just off the behind of it. And so that's exactly what they did. And while his scoring wasn't as high in this space as it was in others, and I do have the splits that I'll talk us through in a moment, he put any kind of, I don't think anyone was hoping he would fail. I think that was wrong. But he proved that he is such a damaging player with the ball in hand, not just when he can set up the play and have time and space on his side, but as you've mentioned, when the heat comes in the kitchen, he's able to cook as well as anybody is.
Yeah, I think the thing that jumps out to me, MJ, before you go into those sort of out splits is even just, you look at the first 7 games he had when he's trying to find that midfield role and he had that move in the middle of the season. He was averaging just under 100. You look at the last 7 games of the season when he's in that role, he's already up at 110, 111 average. So I think even if you just keep it in simple terms of, okay, his first 7 games, he's working out those patterns. He's working out how he fits in. And I feel like that's what this guy's career is all about. Once you give him time to work it out, it doesn't take him very long at all to not only score well, but to hit those uber elite levels. And you look at the one game you'd consider poor, it's a game against Sydney, the top of the ladder team, at the SCG, and North's got pumped. Like, we know North Melbourne's down the bottom, there's going to be more of those results than other teams, but if that's your dud game, is a 78 at the SCG against the Swans, who are, in round 18 are absolutely rolling at this point, and the rest is, 90 plus, and there's some ceiling games in there. I think that's what gives you so much trust in this guy to be like, gee, if the floor is just under an 80 against the best team in the comp and you're a really poor team, no wonder we just want to pick him straight away, because the guy just delivers basically regardless of circumstance.
It's incredible what he did last year. Like, he improved in every element as the year went on. There are some patchier games through the year, but as you mentioned, there's narrative and reason for that. When you kind of look at things in clumps. And it's always dangerous to roll stats up with a player like Sheezel because you can unintended tell yourself a narrative that feels beyond truth. But then when you unpack and look through it, it doesn't feel as, I take the injury impacted game, I take the this, I add the that, I move this number around and get a magical unicorn where it's amazing. We don't have to do too much of that for Sheezel to just see his scoring, because last year in any game, he has 30% centre bounces and no kick-ins. He goes at 113 in fantasy and 121 in Supercoach. That's over a 9-game stretch. Contrast that to that 125 that he's basically doing over the first 7 as that playmaker with really, I think he had like 14% centre bounces in that 7th game that he had in that role. And so it started to move. But in the 5 games, he has 50% centre bounce attendance or more. Now, there is a kick-in that sits in one of these games, so it's why I did the 30% and no kick-in territories for us. He's still up at that 113 in fantasy, so almost identical, and a 124.6, which is, again, almost in that territory of what he did in those first 7 games as the halfback playmaker. And so the narrative I've heard about Harry Sheezel strongly through the preseason is, yeah, he's priced at that near 120 marker in Supercoach. Yeah, he's priced at that 110 plus barrier in AFL fantasy. But that's looking at the data, including what he did in those first 7 games. That's just not what he is. And while absolutely you look at that subsequent sort of 15 odd games after that, it is not the 120. It is back towards that lower territories. It's still pretty much what we're paying for. And so I got lots of questions and thoughts I want to ask you. Are we just overthinking the we'll get him cheaper narrative? Because I understand we should be looking for upside in as many spaces as we could and should. But are we overplaying our hand here and really not really getting much cheaper output from Sheezel in 5-8 rounds later, because he does feel like that kind of guy that can score no matter where he is?
I think we are, MJ, to put it simple. And I'll tell you a stat that jumped out to me looking through Sheezel. He's got 18 career Brownlow votes across the 2 seasons he's played at AFL level. In the last 6 games of last year, he got 11 Brownlow votes.
Wow.
And he's polled in 5 of those 6 games. In those 5 games, which is basically the last 6 minus the Sydney smashing, he's polled 11 Brownlow votes. He's averaging 133 in Supercoach, and he's averaging 121 in fantasy. And the reason I think that's important is he's having an impact. Now, I know Brownlow votes aren't the be-all and end-all, but the scoring's there from both formats, and the performance has been acknowledged by the umpires and saying, this guy's having an impact on the game. And I think that's the scary thing if you avoid this guy. We're saying he's getting better and better as he learns and understands this role. And I think that's pretty clear to see for everyone. It's probably no surprise that those are naturally games where he's had minimum 48% CBAs to go with it. So we're saying this is a guy that's only having between 48 and 63% CBAs in this back end. The fantasy scoring's there. The impact on the game is there. So for me, that gives me immense confidence that that's the Harry Sheezel that we're going to see and the role that the North Melbourne coaching staff want him to play. Because there hasn't been any change there. It's still Clarko at the helm. We know they've been building and building and building. And that's the scary part for me if you fade him. There is no reason he can't come out of the gate in those first 5-6 weeks and be over 120 in AF and over 130 in Supercoach. Conversely, could he have that, 1 poor game or 2 poor games in that stretch? Absolutely. But I feel like when you're building your team, you want this guy. Do you want to risk, maybe getting him a little bit cheaper when, let's be honest, 75 to 90% of the serious coaches have him? I think this is a guy you just don't bet against. You know you want him. The price, I would say, is fair. I don't think there's overly much value. I think he can go 115 plus in DT. I think he can get 120 plus in Supercoach. So maybe there's a fraction here or there. But I think with the way you're building your team, he doesn't have the early bye. He doesn't have his bye until, the first one of the mid-season block. So there's just so many factors where I go, this guy's a captaincy option. We know he can go big. We know that when he got to the midfield, that's when the scoring started getting really, really consistent and the impact on games went through the roof. So you can only imagine in the SuperCoach format, MJ, if they start winning a couple more games, and let's be honest, they're coming from the bottom here. So even if they got to 6 or 7 wins, that's a huge jump. Those 130s might become 150s just because of the nature of the scaling in SuperCoach. So for me, I feel like it's just way too cute. You know you want him. You know he's a top 6 defender. You know he's a captaincy option. I don't know what you're hoping to achieve taking him on. You'd have to be so, so confident with another premium or another combination of players you're bringing in. But it just feels like, is this the guy you really want to bet against? Can you not find another way to be a point of difference elsewhere in your team? That would be the question I'd put back to those coaches that are saying, I'll get him cheaper, I'll get him cheaper.
Yeah, because where the I'll get him cheaper thought is they're probably looking at the entirety of the sort of the back 15 games or 14 games from once he stepped into that midfield role to the end of the season. They're looking at it in totality and they go, well, it's about a 5 point per game drop from what his price is right now. So they're looking at that going, well, okay, that's where the upside's coming. That's where I'll get him. But then, as you mentioned, those final 5 games of the year, he's basically delivering what he's priced at for us. And that includes probably his worst game of the year where he delivers like a 70s across the formats. And so it can become a little bit of confirmation bias for you when it comes to a Harry Sheezel where you go, oh, the last 3 months of the year, the numbers aren't much better. To be fair, they're a kick and a handball difference. It's one effective disposal difference. Like that's what you're talking about. But then you look at the final 5, it's basically what you're paying for to start the year. And we talk about starting the year and a captaincy option. They've got the Bulldogs, they've got Melbourne, they've got Adelaide, they've got Sydney, they've got Gold Coast, they've got Carlton over the first 6 weeks. A Friday game in there, so that's that Carlton Good Friday game. So there's a VC option. He's a Saturday night game against the Bulldogs. I would definitely consider him a VC candidate there. A Sunday game against the Demons, that's definitely the captaincy savings space through there. And then the Crows the subsequent week after that also, if you require it. There's a couple more things I want to ask you specifically about him before we move forward. The playmaking halfback role is gone. Just take that out, regardless of the arrival of Caleb Daniel. He was so good in this midfield forward split that's where he's going to be. He didn't really have any crazy centre bounce heavy numbers last year either. He was still spending a decent amount of time forward. For what it's worth, I do not forecast a space where he'll pick up forward status. That would be a lovely benefit for us. But I think in Fantasy Dream Team and Supercoach, where he can only pick up dual position, the amount of midfield time he spends will be the reason he picks up mid status and not forward status over mid status. So rule that one out. Keeper, where you've got triple position, maybe you get a little bit lucky. But again, I think that's more unlikely than likely. You've talked about how important he is and how damaging he is and how really he's the most impactful per possession player on North Melbourne. And so do we see the tag start to come his way? We haven't seen teams tag North Melbourne too often because they feel like they can beat them relatively on the more comfortable side than not. And if they have tagged, they've gone towards a Luke Davies-Uniacke. Do you see that changing at all for us this year? Is his brilliance with ball in hand so prolific that all of a sudden LDU becomes the second string option?
Well, the honest answer, MJ, is I don't know. He's certainly good enough that he warrants attention. It's probably just one of those ones where it depends what negating player the opposition has, right? There's some, for example, like a Sam Durham. He's a better matchup for a Luke Davies-Uniacke with that sort of mix of size and power, whereas, a James Jordan per se, I know he comes from the half-forward flank to do those sort of jobs. Maybe that matches a Harry Sheezel a bit more. That's the thing about Sheezel that's so fascinating, and it's a little bit similar to Dacos in that sense, is they're on the smaller side compared to, the Bonts, the Dawsons, the Cripps, the Oliver type midfielders. but they still win contested ball. But their transition game and the way they link up and find space and use the ball, you want it in their hands. That's the thing that's a really interesting mix. And that's where it does get really hard in open play is we always hear about team defense. You don't really want to be leaving a hole in that sense to find someone to just run with Harry Sheezel. The same thing happens with Errol Goulden all the time. He's such a hard worker and he links up and he knows the spots to get the ball. They're just really hard to go with. Whereas, a contested player and a burst player like an LDU, you sort of know that at the stoppage, you can get body on him. You can really try to negate that, that burst from a clearance. So I don't know. Again, Harry's play would 100% warrant attention. It's just how coaches do that, and that's the part I'm not sure about. But yeah, he's incredibly he's such a fascinating player, MJ, because to transition so quickly like Nick Dacos did to having a contested game, I think in the past we thought that takes 3 or 4 pre-seasons, not only from a size point of view, but the inside mid-craft. And that's where you go with Harry. Like, we haven't seen this sort of stuff from many players. Like MJ, just even looking, he's kicked 14 goals won last year. 13 of them come in the second half of the season. So when you're really looking at this back end of the year, like the ball winning's still there, the tackling's there. He's adding goal kicking, which puts him into this, this incredible upper echelon of midfielder that every team desires. And yet I'm looking through and I've seen a game where he's got 25 contested possessions and multiple games of 10 plus contested possessions, which for his play style is more than enough. If you're at 10 contested possessions, going with the extra sort of 15, 20 he gets uncontested, like no wonder he got all those Brownlow votes. Like that is an enormous impact on the game. So he definitely warrants a tag. It's just, is it possible in the way teams want to play? Is it just easier to go, we've got someone that can go with LDU in those stoppages, in those centre bounces, and not we let Harry just run wherever he wants, but there's just some spots he's going to get the ball that's not dangerous space. And that's the beautiful thing about Sheezel is he can take a ball in not dangerous space and execute a kick that all of a sudden unlocks the whole ground. So that's where these guys like Dacos, Gould and Sheezel, the ball users, are so incredible because they can take a ball that's, not considered dangerous and all of a sudden lead to a goal for their team. So he definitely warrants it, MJ, but I'm just not sure the types that teams have that will gravitate to him and how that structure works. If they want to take a player and basically have one less player in their defence and just worry about man marking Sheezel. So that's a big curiosity. It obviously would have an impact, but are we talking once or twice a year?
Well, and that's it. We just trying to find some gaps and narratives away from that. I think that there's kind of 2 things that for me become the intriguing points that feel narrative enough for me to fade interest in starting. One is just around how does this North Melbourne team move the ball and can they improve? They're one of the worst teams from a fantasy and a SuperCoach total team points perspective. The SuperCoach one should be of no shock given the weighting and how poorly they've been beaten. Fantasy, I think they're about 50 points per game below the AFL average, and you take out that historical scoring of your West Coasts and your Richmond, which are just historically feel real one-off isolations, they're still pretty poor. He's got a decent market share. It's him and Cherry that are over 7 for pure AFL fantasy market share. And then you've got a couple of new interesting dynamics you've introduced in. Finn O'Sullivan looks like he's coming in off the wing, but has got inside midfield credibility. Do they trajectory-wise develop him the same way they did Sheezel or not? We'll wait and see. McKercher, again, has been another that has been alluded to spend some time off that half back, but do they put him in the wing and also, much like Sheezel, give him some centre bounce opportunities and see how he flies? There's no George Wardlaw early, which probably bodes better for Parker and Simpkin to see an element of upside on their centre bounce presence. And then we've already talked about someone like an LDU. How do you see this team? I see them improving, not drastically, but I certainly see them doing much better than they have over the last couple of years and outside of the bottom 2 pretty comfortably for mine. Where do you see this ball movement take place? Because I think that's one of the only things that might clip Sheezel a little bit. While he's their best ball user, some of that contested element might not be as required.
Yeah, it's funny, MJ, because that's always the hard thing when you're constructing a midfield, right? Is you look at Davies, Uniacke, Wardlaw, Phillips, Simpkin, Powell, and Parker. They're not real ball users. They're more get the ball forward. Some of them have really good assets in the forward line when you think about a Parker, and even when Jai Simpkin started his career as a small forward type, like they can go forward and kick a goal. Davies Uniacke's added that. We know Powell's had numerous different roles throughout his time in the AFL, but as I said, the ones that are so special in the comp now are ones that are elite ball users. Bont, Dawson, Dacos, Sheezel's in that conversation, but they've also got a contested game. So I think that's what makes them be able to only have sort of 40 to 60% centre bounces and yet still be such consistent scorers, as they can start in different positions and still get involved in the game. So for me, looking at that midfield mix, like I'd want Sheezel in there as much as possible, just because he can be a first touch player, he can win that contested ball. But obviously the real damage and where he complements those other guys is if he's the receiver out of the centre bounce and he's streaming towards 50, you feel like he's going to make the right decision 9 times out of 10, don't you? And he's going to be able to execute that pass to a Larky, a Zerha, whoever in that forward line. So I think for me, he really is the superstar. And I think he actually helps LDU a lot. And LDU's obviously got that incredible burst and he can really extract himself from contest and link up with other players. But the other guys, let's be honest, MJ, in the scheme of AFL midfields, outside of Sheezel and LDU, and as good as Parker is, it's the latter stage of his career. You look at some of the other midfields that are Brisbane rollout, and you think, you need 5 or 6 really good players. And at the moment, North aren't there, and that's probably why in the past they've finished where they have. So for me, I'd have Sheezel in there as much as you really can, which is probably 60% at a max, just because he can go and rest at other different lines, probably half forward with the way he just contributes on the scoreboard and the other pieces they brought in. So for me, he's just simply that good, MJ. You just got to have him on. His time on ground shouldn't be anything short of 80 to 85% every week. I think he could play 90 if required, but obviously when you play a bit more inside, just by nature, you probably do need those extra rests just with that physical toll. So, I wouldn't be worried about that. But as you mentioned, when it's an unknown and you're at this price tag, it does naturally lead to sort of negative thoughts, doesn't it, about starting them? Because you're going, he's already up here. What if this piece and this piece do this? It's easier to say that he's going to regress than say that's going to provide him a greater upside, because we already know historically once you're at 112 average or close to 120 in SuperCoach, it's easier to fall, isn't it, than progress. So I think that's why those unknown of new faces works in people's mind against him. But at the same time, with the way the comp's going, it is the superstars that are getting these big points. And every trait that we've mentioned, Harry Sheezel has. So for me, let alone getting him as a defender, I just don't quite understand how you wouldn't just start him and be on your merry way.
Yeah, there's the two lines of thought, and it's why he's so high in the 50 most relevant, because you're basically paying for what you get. As far as I can see, I don't see a world of drastic scoring regression. I do not believe this midfield role has hurt his fantasy scoring at all. I think with the improvement of the team around him, the addition of his goal scoring elements that you've unpacked through that moving forward, those two things have been protected by the loss of kick-ins and the loss of easy uncontestable in defensive 50. He's so good, so smart, so professional, so high footy IQ that I feel like those two things balance it out. But as you've mentioned, do you happy to just lock in D1 and go, I'm building around it. I've got the cash. I don't want to fart around with a D1 that's not in the captaincy consideration. I'm getting value everywhere in my forward line. The rucks, I'm not a fan of. I just need another VCC option because there's value aplenty in the midfield. There's a strong and compelling narrative to get Sheezel that you might see a 5 points per game of regression. But is that really enough of a reason to turn you away from getting him, knowing that he's got that 120, 130 ceiling about him and in the midfield role to make you really think you're going to save that 10, 20, 30K and force the trade? I'm not too sure, let alone if you're also fading a Bont, fading a Merritt, fading a Gorn, fading what it gets very hard to get all these players in at the cheap price point all at the same time. While on the flip side, you look at the defensive value in the midfield and go, ooh, there is enough little bit of a question mark here and there on the team's share and how it all works. And I got Mills, I got Roberts, I got Short, I've got Sam de Koning, I've got Rivers, I've got McKercher, I've got all these value options. I'll just make 50 to 150K off all of these guys, depending on the spot they're at, and then trade into him once I know. That's the beauty of SuperCoach, Fantasy, and Dream Team. Both of these ideologies hold water and hold merit. It all then comes down to, how do you like to play the game? What is the pain you want to absorb? At some point, it's pain. It will be painful watching McKercher as a non-owner and painful trading into him because it won't come cheap. But it'll also be painful seeing a guy you pay up at that top end for not delivering potentially for one or two of those weeks. What pain are you going to take? That becomes the dilemma. And on draft day, well, on the keeper platform, just the one person gets to choose him. As far as I'm concerned, this is the number one defender. Just across the formats, I'll hear a conversation about Zorko and Whitfield, but to me, I'm very, very bullish on Harry Sheezel maintaining that 110 scoring across the formats pretty comfortably. Where does he go off the draft board for you, Kane? Because it could range anywhere in that first round for depending on who the coach in the league is.
MJ, if it's just a one ruck league with no utility, this guy's the number one pick for me. That's how high I've got him. He's number one pick for me. And just the last thing on what you were saying about salary cap before, the hard thing with any of these guys that you know are top tier, you really need that poor score to strike just as you're doing your upgrades. So you need that score to be around 6, 7, 8. If the poor score is round 1, by the time you get to upgrading, it's probably course corrected and he's back where he is anyway. So that's where I just go, you really have to thread the needle here. You need this poor score to happen in the perfect slot and then you get him. I would just much rather go, no, I want this guy. There will be a player or two that have their poor score and a value, or they have an injury and we can get them cheaper. Like, let them come to you. That could be a person that you go, wow, that value, they're a perfect MA or they're a perfect M7, where maybe they're not the top, but when you factor in the price and the upgrade now, that's great. I just would not be betting on this guy having the poor score at the exact round you need it to get the upgrade. Because like we know, MJ, how many times does that window pop up where they are cheaper and you got 5 other fires to put out? You push it a week, they drop a 150, and next thing you know, you don't have him. The competition started him. So that's just the last thing I wanted to say on that is,
yeah, it's good.
You are trying to split the atom, thread the needle, whatever saying you want to say for it. You're just putting so much pressure on yourself. But back on draft, durability tick, scoring power tick. He's matching the best midfielders with the defender status. That's the tipping point for me. I think these mids, there's so many good ones. Last year was a funny year where we didn't have the person having their career year. You know, you think of a Bontempelli the year prior, MJ, where it was like, we knew this guy's a stud. We kept saying, this guy can't finish his career with a career high average of 107 in D-Tech. Like, this is just, he's so much better than that. And then we saw it. Yeah. And it was an incredible year. You know, it was the career year where he's 117 and he's 135 in SuperCoach. And it's just like, yeah, that's a season fitting of the caliber of a Marcus Bontempelli. Like, we know he's that good.
Yeah.
So when I look at the mids, it's just this cluster of guys where I go, depending what time I'm drafting in the day, what side of the bed I wake up on, I can't split a bunch of them. So if you're going to give me the defender, that just makes my life easy. And with rucks, again, Sherry and Marshall are brilliant. You know, Gorn's a superstar year in, year out. But if I don't have a utility spot, really, I'm getting a guy that's a low 90. And I'm getting them as my 10th ruck. So that's where I go. For me, it's Sheezel. I can't want anything more from him. I'm not even expecting him to improve his average. Even if he just goes 110 for me as a defender, I'm stoked. So for me, he's the clear number one. After that, I'll hear your arguments on how you value rucks.
Yeah.
We probably value them less than other people in a draft that's a single season and no utility, but it also depends on captaincy and all these different variations. But for me, Sheezel is the walk-up number one pick in a single season this year.
Love it, mate. Oh, first defender off the board. For me, it's format dependent. I couldn't take him number one overall in SuperCoach. I'd find it really hard to not pick a Gorn or a Bont number one there, but I'm with you. If I got a number one pick on draft day on the keeper platform, fancy.
On keeper is number one. SuperCoach, I will hear an argument. But if we're on keeper, it's Sheezel for mine. You're right. In SuperCoach, just with the way defenders do get a nice little boost in that format with the 1%ers and the intercept marks and all that jazz. But you're nearly there, mate. Couple to go.
Couple more to go. If you're just catching up on the 50 most relevant, the good news is go back in time, wherever you're checking out this episode. All the other players are sitting there. There's 48 of them now when you include this episode to go and check out. Make sure you do so. Inside the description of the episode, all the details where you can get in touch with us, become part of our Patreon, and also get your hands on some Coaches Panel merch. Hey, Kane, as always, an absolute pleasure, mate. Thanks for jumping on the 50 most relevant.
Pleasure, mate. Thank you.
Are you ready for a clue for who's at number 2? Politely, I can't really give you a clue because there's just 2 guys left. You know who they are. There's no sneaky Riley Sanders arrival happening here. It's Baz Lenker and it's Tristan Cherry. Those are the 2 options that I've got left. So the question you've got to ask yourself is who is at number 2? Is it the dominant ruckman that broke out and surged home to end the year? Do I think he's the most relevant? Or is it one of the greatest value gifts we've got in our forward line, the running machine that's got 115 pedigree on his head that's cheaper in the forward line and in a team that's promised him midfield? It's one of those 2. I'll give you a 50-50 guess. The good news is you find out whether you're right or wrong tomorrow.